So we've created bumpers and we've created the ball and we have ourselves a very basic environment. But for obvious reasons, this isn't exactly adding the core part of any game engine, which is, some form of interactivity. So it's a good idea for us to start looking at how we're going to go about doing that. Now, the first step when it comes to creating a pinball game and adding interactivity, the most obvious thing is for us to add flippers. So let's go about doing that. I'm going to go to my blueprints folder and I'm going to create a new blueprint class. This is going to be called, it's going to be an actor, and it's going to be called Flipper. Now, Flipper is going to require one thing that we have yet to import, which is a mesh. So I'm going to go to my assets folder, and I'm just going to drag in the Flipper mesh. This is one of those ones that I actually do want the auto-generated collision to be enabled, so I'm just going to check that box. I'm now going to hit import. And we've got ourselves a basic flipper. Now, I'm going to go open up the flipper blueprint, and I'm going to look at it in the viewport. So add component, add static mesh, and we now have a 3D model representing the flipper. If I go to here, I'm going to go click, and there's our base model. Now you'll see that the pivot point, which is where the object rotates from, is located there, and the flipper itself comes along here. Now, here's the first trick that we're going to have with the flippers. Whenever I click the flip button, I really want to do the same thing regardless of whether it's on the left side or whether it's on the right side. So what we're going to be doing is basically creating a setup such that if I tell the flipper that it's a left flipper, it's going to be here. But if it's a right flipper, it's going to be over here and facing inside this way. So the easiest way for us to do that is with the construction script. Now, another thing that you'll notice that I've done here is that unlike with the previous objects where I set the static mesh component to be the root component of the blueprint, I haven't in this case. And the reason for that is that I want this to be a stable, the default scene root, to be a stable anchor point that the flipper itself is going to be rotating from. So with that in mind, what I'm going to do is open up the construction script. And we're now going to have a quick experiment with what happens if I get my flipper, I drag it in, and I try setting the relative scale to be -1, 1. At the moment by default the scale on this object is 1, 1, 1, but in the construction script I'm now going to plug this in and set this up to be -1, 1. I'm going to go to my viewport and hit compile. Now you should have seen what just happened there, which is that the object itself flipped because the x-axis, which is the red axis, has now been inverted, which results in all of the areas that would be up here to be over here. So this is a useful technique for us creating a mirrored object, but I really want to have some way of identifying if this is the left or the right. So this is going to be our first introduction to enums. Now within the blueprints folder, I'm going to create something else here. I'm going to go new blueprints and I'm going to create an enumeration. Now an enum, in this case it's going to be called flip type. I'm going to double click on it. Essentially allows me to add some values that will be present in any drop box where this enum is set as a value. So I'm going to create a left and I'm going to create a right enum, and that's all I'm going to really need for the time being. So I've got left and I've got right set up as values. To do that, if you missed it, I just clicked the new button on the top right here. Now back in Flipper, I'm now going to add a variable, which is going to be called flip type, and I'm going to set it to be of data type. Okay, and you'll see that when I compile it, we now have a drop-down box that has the two variables that I just created, left and right. And all I'm going to do here is in my construction script, I'm going to disconnect my current set relative scale. I'm going to drag in my flip type. I'm going to get it. I'm now going to drag off of it and type in the word switch. And what this essentially is going to do for us is when the construction script runs, it's going to say, is it the left or is it the right? If it's the right, flip it. If it's the left, keep it as it is. The other thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to check this little button here, which allows it to be editable as an item that's actually placed in the world. And what I mean by that is if I look at the flipper in the world now, so I've just dragged it in, You'll notice that on the right hand side here, flip type is now a variable, and if I click that and set it to right or left, it's now going to change accordingly. So we have ourselves a flip type, but at the moment it's only controlling the scale of the thing. But if you think about it, we also wanted to control the rotation of the object as well, so that when it's left, it flips up this way to hit, but when it's right, it flips up this way to hit, which is actually an inverse rotation. So again, we can do something a little bit cheeky here, and that is we can use the switch on flip type, or we can use a select node. Now, the first thing that I need to do to get this set up is I'm going to quickly just pull these across to make it a little bit neater. I'm going to go create a variable. I'm going to add variable, and this is just going to be called start rotation. I'm going to set it to be a rotator variable, and I'm now going to duplicate that, but this one is now going to be end rotation. Now that I've added the two rotation variables, I'm going to set them up. So remember that I can't enter any information there until I've compiled the blueprint, so I'm just going to click compile. And I'm going to set my start rotation to be equal to, this is going to be 20 when it's the left flipper, and it's going to be negative 20 when it's the right flipper. Now, I could use this branch over here to kind of do a couple of extra set nodes, but another way that I could do it is if I drag in start rotation, and I click set, I can drag in. Now you can also hold down the Alt key to just drag it in without having to do that entire extra click. I'm going to drag these two up, and I'm just going to quickly rig this up. So I'm going to set the two rotation variables. Now at the moment it's setting them to 0, 0, which isn't what I want. What I actually want instead is I'm going to drag off of this, and I'm going to type in select. And what select does is, given a certain wildcard entry, it will choose the option according to what's plugged into there. So by that I mean that if I get flip type as an example, I get it and I plug it into the wildcard entry, notice that these two options rename themselves to left and right. Now what this means is that if left is plugged in, it's going to be set to 0, 0, I'm going to set that to 20, and if right is plugged in, negative 20. So now I've got that, I'm just going to do the same thing over here for end rotation. But I'm going to flip these two around so that one of them goes from negative 20 to 20. Fantastic. Compile, save, wonderful. Now that we've got those two in there, the other thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to set the current relative rotation to be whatever the start rotation has been set as. So I'm going to get this, I'm going to drag in a reference to my flipper, I'm going to call set rotation, and the one that we're after is set relative rotation. And the new rotation is going to be equal to the start rotation. Again, if you're dragging in a variable and you don't want to click on things, you can hold down Control for a get or Alt for a set. So now that start rotation is plugged in, if I go to my viewport and I hit compile, you'll notice that it automatically flipped down to the ready position. And it's going to go up to here whenever we hit the flip button later on. But we haven't added that functionality just yet. So that's our basic construction script setup. Let's now go to the event graph and quickly get in the final part of the flipper so that we can get everything working. I'm going to go to my event graph, and what we're going to do is make two custom functions, one called flip, custom event is what I typed in. I'm now going to type in the word flip, and I'm also going to create another custom event, and this is going to be called flop. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to get my flipper, I'm going to drag it in, and I'm going to do what's called move component to. Now this is a very useful little function that for some reason doesn't get a whole lot of use by a lot of people. I think it's kind of just snuck past. But essentially the move component to function is when you call move, it's going to gradually, over a given time period, in this case by default it's set to 0.2, go from where it is to the location and rotation that you've requested it to go to. And you just don't need to think about it afterwards. So you kind of just call that and it will cleanly start moving in and moving out. Now the reason that we're doing this is we're going to tell the flipper on move to rotate to our end rotation, which has been set in the construction script. So I'm going to do control drag, I'm just going to plug this in, and it's probably a good idea for us to also add in a better flip time. At the moment it's going to be set to 0.2. This is something that we might want to change, so I'm just going to right click on that and promote it to a variable, and I'm just going to call this flip time. So we've got flip time in there. Again, I can't change it until I hit compile. Now it's in there. I'm also, just while I'm at it really quickly, going to add a flop, which is the exact same thing as what I just did, except instead of it being the end rotation, so I'm going to hit Control W to duplicate. Instead of it being the end rotation, we now want it to be going back to the start rotation. So a quick way to demonstrate this is, let's tell the game that when it begins, flip it, wait a second, flop it, wait a second, and then repeat. This will give us a nice demonstration of the functionality. So all I'm going to do here is on begin play, which again is when the game starts up, I'm going to call flip, which is now going to be present as a function. After flipping, I'm going to call delay, which waits a given amount of time. In this case, I'm just going to wait 1 second, sounds good. And I'm now going to call, after the delay, flop. Oops, flop. The other thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another delay, and I'm just going to be kind of cheeky. This is just for the sake of testing, and plug this into here. This will get deleted in just a moment, but it'll help us kind of demonstrate what's going on for the time being. So we're now going to just continuously run this cycle over and over again. And if I hit compile and simulate, you can now see it's flipping and it's flopping. And if this was equal to, if I stop, and if I was to set this to be a right one and hit play, you can now see that it's flipping and flopping the other way around instead, which is correct behavior. Fantastic. So we've got our flippers in there. It's time for us to now look at how we can activate this functionality from the player controller itself. I'm going to quickly delete these nodes so that they don't get in the way. And what I'm going to do from here is start looking at how a player controller can accept input from the player and pass them on to flippers within the world. So we're almost done with this flipper, however we still have something left to do. And that is, if I look at this in here, or if I drop it into the world, we can clearly see that, it's pretty ugly. So let's go ahead and actually fix that. What I'm going to be going to do is just creating a very simple material that we're going to share across a bunch of the assets in this project. It's just a very, very, very simple plastic material that we're going to create. So essentially, all I need you to do is we're going to go Assets, I'm going to right click, and I'm going to create a new material. And this is just going to be called M_simple plastic. And simple plastic is just going to be roughness value. So I held down 1 and I left clicked to add a constant. I'm going to set that to 0.1. If I plug that into roughness, you can now see that we get this nice smooth effect. I'm then going to add a vector parameter, so again I'm going to hold V, and once more I'm going to name it color, and I'm going to plug that into my base color. I'm also just going to give it a nice simple base color that can be our default color that we use across the board. I'm going to go for something that's kind of a lighter blue, I think. It's nice. Okay, save. Now the reason I've gone off and created this with a vector parameter is we're going to need a couple of different plastic types. So I'm going to right click on the material that we've created, simple plastic, and I'm going to create what's called a material instance. I'm going to rename it to mi_simple plastic. Now it's essentially the exact same material as what we've already created. However, it lets us change any of the parameters in it into anything else. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make this one yellow. And if I double click it, you'll see that the color parameter has been exposed here. So if I click color, I can now set it to any type of color that we really want. In this case, I'm going to go for it's pretty yellow. Save. I'm also going to make a generic white one as well. So I'm just going to duplicate the existing instance. Instead of calling it _yellow, it's going to be white. Nice. Save. And now in the flipper mesh, I'm simply going to set this up to have white top and yellow on the inside, which I think will look okay. Actually, I might go the other way around now that I think about it. Yellow and white. Just going to save that. You can now see that we have something that's a bit more obvious in the world for us to flip around. And again, this is represented nicely inside of the asset itself and in the blueprint. So, the next section that we're going to be adding is going to be adding the functionality for the player to actually control the flippers so we can start to get a game together.